We finished last week on the note which is sounded in Hebrews chapter 2 verse 1. We must pay more careful attention to what we have heard so that we do not drift away. When people swim in the sea, they have to beware of the riptide, the fast-moving body of water that will carry people quickly far out to sea. It has claimed many lives. There is definitely a riptide with the potential to carry people away from being followers of Jesus. It has claimed even more lives. It is called suffering. Whether we are talking about mental or physical pain here, or the suffering of injustices through persecution, when we suffer, we are humiliated. Our suffering can fill our vision and occupy our thoughts to the extent that even the threat of suffering can be enough to knock us off course in following Jesus. But it doesn't have to. We're reminded in verse 10 of chapter 2 that God is the one for whom and through whom everything exists. That everything must include suffering, mustn't it? We often forget that suffering is part of God's good creation. A bit like the warning lights on the dashboard of a car, we were designed to get alerts that tell us when we are misusing the kit. Without the warning light of suffering, we would be in big trouble. So suffering isn't a rival God. It's a part of his good creation, which has fallen into the wrong hands. In verse 14, we are reminded whose hands? The devil's, the one who holds the power of death. And in verse 15, we are told how he uses it. He uses it to enslave people by their fear of death. In the devil's hands, suffering is a weapon for tempting people. Hence the reference in verse 18 to Jesus being tempted. And the temptation is specifically to make us unfaithful to the God who has called us. Hence the emphasis on Jesus' faithfulness in chapter 3 and verses 1 and 2. We know how this works, don't we? In suffering, perhaps we already feel just a little bit let down by God. How could he let this happen to me? And we feel all alone. And we know, in theory, that Jesus is Lord of all, but right now, we do not see everything subject to him. That's chapter 2 and verse 8. There's no help in sight then. How long are we expected to hold the fort, to be faithful? We don't know. So, runs the temptation, why be faithful? Take care of yourself. No one else will. Now, God's answer to suffering falling into the wrong hands isn't to abolish it altogether, but to take hold of it into the right hands. We see from this passage that it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. The creation was always meant to be ruled by God and people together. That happens to suffering in Jesus' hands. It stops being the ruler and it gets ruled. We see from verse 9 that he was humbled, made a little lower than the angels, but is now crowned with glory and honour because he suffered death. In suffering, Jesus is faithful to the Father and faithful to us, as we see in verses 11 to 14. He identifies himself with us in our suffering. Without his suffering, there would be no way he could really identify with us. Without fully identifying with us, how could he be, verse 17, a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God? And how could he make atonement for our sins? So what? Well, the so what carries on throughout this chapter, but verses 5 and following carry a reminder to start off with that we are called to be co-rulers with Jesus of the world to come. As Jesus rules, so do his people. He doesn't rule suffering by escaping from it or running away from it. He rules it by being faithful in the face of it. And it's in suffering that, of course, Jesus' love and compassion for us are demonstrated most powerfully. And it's in suffering that his faithfulness to the Father's will is demonstrated most powerfully. As Jesus rules, so do his people. we're being exhorted to do the same, ruling with Jesus in the face of suffering. We do not currently look like co-regents of the world to come, verse 8. Well, no, and neither did Jesus, did he? And we know where he is now, verse 9. So when, not if, we endure suffering because of our faith in Jesus, and we find ourselves being tempted to bail out and look after number one, we could instead take the suffering as evidence, which it is, that we truly belong to him. Both the one who makes men holy and those who are being made holy are of the same family, verse 11. That was what made the apostles rejoice back in Acts chapter 5, verse 41. And when we suffer, verse 18, we can turn to him for help on how to resist temptation and remain faithful. If you have been, thank you for listening.